In this video, we will talk about the Cold War, key events and figures. The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies, following World War II. This conflict, which lasted from 1947 to 1991, was characterized by a struggle for global influence and ideological supremacy. The Cold War did not involve direct military conflict between the superpowers, but was marked by proxy wars, nuclear arms races, espionage, and intense political and military competition. This discussion will explore the key events and figures that shaped the Cold War era, highlighting the significance of this period in modern history. Origins of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the final stages of World War II. Although the United States and the Soviet Union were allies during the war, their relationship began to deteriorate as the war came to an end. The two nations had vastly different ideologies. The United States promoted democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union advocated for communism and a centrally planned economy. 1. Yalta and Potsdam Conferences, 1945. In the Yalta and Potsdam Conferences, the Allied leaders met to discuss the post-war order. Disagreements over the future of Europe, particularly the division of Germany and the fate of Eastern European countries, set the stage for Cold War tensions. 2. Iron Curtain Speech, 1946. Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946 highlighted the division of Europe into communist and capitalist blocs. The term Iron Curtain came to symbolize the ideological and physical boundary separating Eastern and Western Europe. 3. Truman Doctrine, 1947. President Harry S. Truman articulated the Truman Doctrine in 1947, declaring that the United States would support countries resisting communism. This policy marked the beginning of the U.S. strategy of containment, aimed at preventing the spread of communism. 4. Marshall Plan, 1948. The Marshall Plan was an American initiative to provide economic aid to Western European countries to help them rebuild after World War II. This plan was also intended to prevent the spread of communism by promoting economic stability and prosperity in Europe. Key events of the Cold War. The Cold War was defined by a series of significant events that shaped global politics for nearly half a century. These events illustrate the depth of the rivalry between the superpowers and the impact of the Cold War on various regions of the world. 1. Berlin Blockade and Airlift, 1948 to 1949. The Soviet Union attempted to cut off access to West Berlin by blockading the city. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year. The blockade ultimately failed, but it deepened the division of Germany and intensified Cold War tensions. 2. NATO and Warsaw Pact, 1949 to 1955. In 1949, the United States and its Western allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance aimed at countering Soviet influence. In response, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies established the Warsaw Pact in 1955, creating two opposing military blocs in Europe. 3. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War was one of the first major conflicts of the Cold War. North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, which was backed by the United States and its allies. The war ended in a stalemate, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel. The Korean War underscored the global nature of the Cold War and the willingness of the superpowers to engage in proxy wars. 4. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. The Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. When the U.S. discovered the missiles, a tense standoff ensued, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was eventually resolved through negotiations, with the Soviets agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba and secretly agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey. 5. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The Vietnam War was another major Cold War conflict, with North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, fighting against South Vietnam, backed by the United States. The war ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975, leading to the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. The Vietnam War was a deeply divisive conflict in the U.S., leading to widespread protests and a reevaluation of U.S. foreign policy. 6. Space Race, 1957 to 1969. The Cold War extended beyond the Earth, as the U.S. and the Soviet Union competed for dominance in space exploration. The Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. The U.S. responded by landing the first humans on the moon in 1969, a significant achievement that symbolized American technological superiority. 7. Prague Spring, 1968. The Prague Spring was a period of political liberalization in Czechoslovakia, where the government attempted to implement reforms to create socialism with a human face. The Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies responded by invading Czechoslovakia to crush the reforms, demonstrating the Soviet commitment to maintaining control over Eastern Europe. 8. Detente and SALT Treaties, 1970s. In the 1970s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union pursued a policy of detente, seeking to reduce Cold War tensions through diplomacy and arms control agreements. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, resulted in treaties that limited the number of nuclear weapons each superpower could possess. While detente eased tensions, it was ultimately short-lived. 9. Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked the beginning of a long and costly conflict. The U.S. supported Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, with weapons and funding. The war drained Soviet resources and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. 10. Fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of the Cold War. The wall had been a physical and ideological barrier between East and West Berlin, and its fall marked the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The reunification of Germany and the dissolution of the Soviet Union soon followed. Key figures of the Cold War. The Cold War was shaped by leaders like Truman, who introduced the Truman Doctrine, and Stalin, who expanded Soviet influence. Khrushchev's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's leadership during this tense period were pivotal. Reagan's hardline stance, Gorbachev's reforms, and figures like Churchill, Castro, Mao, and Walesa also played key roles in shaping the era. The Cold War was a complex and multifaceted conflict that shaped the second half of the 20th century. It was a struggle for global influence and ideological dominance between the United States and the Soviet Union, with far-reaching consequences for the entire world. The key events and figures of the Cold War left a lasting impact on international relations, politics, and society. Although the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, its legacy continues to influence global affairs to this day. What do you think of our video? Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button. Also, subscribe to our channel before you go. Thank you for watching.